Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the last Israel brief for 2021. Can you believe we are already at the end of the year? To be quite honest, I can't even remember where we were this time last year. I just know that we were still battling the pandemic, and hopefully it will be a very different situation this time next year. I'm Rolene Marks. This is the Israel Brief, where we bring you those top stories making headlines every Monday to Thursday right here. And as always, we're brought to you by Lay of the Land, your premier content provider on all things Israel, the region, and the Jewish world. Now, today we're going to do a brief with a difference because it's really the second last day of 2021 and so much has happened in Israel. We are going to take a look back at some of those top stories which dominated the headlines. Now, it's in no particular order, but as we go into 2022, the main concern on Israel's agenda, specifically national security, is the Iranian threat. Iran is very close to gaining its nuclear weapon, and we know that Iran has threatened not just Israel, but other countries who it has firmly in its sights. And we've seen evidence of this over the year with some very aggressive language, not to mention some of the visuals we've seen in the last couple of weeks of maps of Israel with targets and warnings like one wrong move. Now, our security establishment, head of the defense, our defense minister Benny Gantz has been doing his shuttle diplomacy to the United States and back, as has our foreign minister and prime minister. A historical moment just weeks ago as Foreign Minister Yair Lapid co-authored an op-ed in the UK's Telegraph newspaper with Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary of the United Kingdom, stating our solidarity with each other and that we will not allow Iran to become nuclear. Over the year, Israel has struck targets in Syria and Lebanon to push back encroaching Iranian hegemony. And of course, we know that Hezbollah in the south of Lebanon and Hamas and other terror entities in the Gaza Strip are sponsored by Iran. They're Iranian proxies, and every now and then like to flex their muscles with terror attacks or rocket and mortar attacks on Israeli civilians. Of course, no talks on the Iranian issue would be complete without the United States, and there have been several intense conversations with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense on how we prevent Iran from going nuclear. We are just weeks away from knowing whether or not some kind of agreement has been reached through the Vienna talks and where we stand there. But going into 2022, keeping Iran back from Israel and not allowing Iran to become nuclear remains Israel's top priority. Now, after 4 elections with no clear winner or coalition, Israel finally has a coalition government. Now, it's the most broad-based coalition in the history of the country, quite extraordinary, and encompasses political parties from the left, like Meretz, to the right, like Yamina HaChadash, and parties in between. What is really extraordinary about this coalition is that it was an Arab Islamist party called Ra'am, chaired by Mansour Abbas, who really was the deciding factor whether or not the proposed Lapid-Bennett coalition would go forward or if he would go with Netanyahu and the Likud. He opted to go with Lapid and Bennett, and even though the coalition government disagrees on many issues, on the big issues, there is alignment. And who can forget just weeks ago the historical words by Mansour Abbas when he said, Israel is and always will be a Jewish state, a clear departure from statements made by Arab parties in the past. So where does this leave Prime Minister or previous Prime Minister Bibi Netanyahu? Well, he now heads the coalition. The previous Prime Minister is beset with his own set of legal woes, which are being heard in Israel's courts at the moment. But as far as leadership is concerned, we have a rotation deal between Prime Minister Bennett and Foreign Minister Lapid, which will see a period of power for 2 years each. It has been signed into law, so it will happen. And also this year, we saw a change in presidents. Our wonderful President Reuven Rivlin, he stepped down, his tenure came to an end, and President Isaac Herzog was sworn in as Israel's 11th president. But don't worry, Reuven is kept very busy these days. He has met a brand new lady love, and we wish them everything of the best. Now, the year started off quite extraordinarily for Israel as we moved from becoming the innovation nation to becoming the vaccination nation. Israel was the first country to kick off its mass vaccination rollout and has led in terms of proportionality and in terms of speed of the rollout. At the moment, Israel is conducting trials at Sheba Medical Center to see whether or not it is viable or if we need to roll out a fourth vaccine or second booster to deal with the Omicron variant. Israel also led with the starting of booster shots and has been a leading authority on how to deal with vaccines and the pandemic. Many countries engaging with Israel for best practice ideas. But it hasn't been without controversy. We still have large swaths of the public who don't want to be vaccinated for a variety of reasons. And we also saw some controversy with our neighbors, the Palestinians. Israel offered to send vaccines as a part of our being good neighborly, but also sharing the same epidemiology. Let me try to say that again. It's not so easy when you have to say these big words on camera. Epidemiological, there we go, finally got it. Someone give me a whiskey. Footprint. However, the Palestinians said no. They have their own Ministry of Health and would procure their own vaccines. Now, this led to a lot of controversy, and Israel was criticized in the mainstream media by many who thought that it was Israel's responsibility to vaccinate Palestinians. However, two very important points. Number one, the Palestinians didn't want it, saying they are responsible for their own. And number two, we are not bound by legal treaties such as the Oslo Accords to be responsible for the healthcare of the Palestinians. This was just a gesture of good neighborliness. Also very controversial was the Palestinian Authority refusing COVID aid coming from the United Arab Emirates because it landed in Israel. Right now, everybody is all eyes on Israel to see when we will be lifting the travel ban. Israel, like many other countries, currently has a ban on foreign travel, which means that anybody who is not a citizen or a resident of our country cannot enter. We are really hoping to hear some good news coming up soon. And it wouldn't be 2021 without speaking about the big event that happened in May this year. After a period of relative quiet from 2014, Israel had to engage in Operation Shomer Chomot, or Guardians of the Wall, due to disputes over the Temple Mount and a rent dispute over the Sheikh Jarrah neighborhood in Jerusalem. Hamas used these opportunities to launch a conflagration against Israel. They fired the first rockets towards Jerusalem. Now, we must just mention that firing towards Jerusalem means that they put holy Muslim religious sites very much on their target list. And what followed was 11 days of intense fighting with over 4,300 rockets, projectiles and mortars being fired from the Gaza Strip into Israel towards Israeli civilians. The IDF mounted a defensive strategy and defensive operation, and also thanks to our Iron Domes, we managed to keep Israeli civilians and citizens safe. 13 Israeli citizens were killed and over 200 Palestinians, the majority of them terrorists. We also can't forget that at least 460 rockets either misfired or fell short in the Gaza Strip, killing and injuring many, many Palestinians. And it was also not without its controversy. A lot of criticism leveled towards Israel for blowing up the media house that housed the Associated Press and Al Jazeera. However, intelligence reports saying that Hamas was using it as a base to launch projectiles and missiles towards Israel to try and overwhelm our Iron Domes. Another controversy was Israel's, well, I think it was just audacious and full of chutzpah, but some thought it was controversial. Our very ambiguous tweet by the spokesperson of the IDF, Colonel Jonathan Conricus, who may not or may have said that there were troops or ground troops fighting in Gaza. He didn't say that we were in on the ground in Gaza, but Hamas thought we were and scurried all their terrorists into the tunnels to launch surprise attacks on what they thought would be Israeli troops entering the strip. However, they were in for a surprise when they got zapped by ordnance fired from the Israeli Air Force onto their tunnels, thereby eliminating them. But after 11 days of intense fighting, a ceasefire was brokered by Egypt, and at the moment we do have a very, very tacit calm. And our final story, one to really celebrate as we head into the new year, is Israel and our Abrahamic brothers, the United Arab Emirates, Morocco, Bahrain, and yes, we know Sudan have also normalized, but to date they're not part of the great Abrahamic Union, have celebrated a year of normalization and peace ties, and the results have been phenomenal. Beautiful friendships have been born between Emiratis, Moroccans, Bahrainis and Israelis. A ton of travel, when travel has been permitted, has happened. But most important, the level of cooperation and memorandums of understanding has been absolutely extraordinary, proving that peace not only has taken flight, but is also paying dividends. And we cannot wait to see how we will end 2022. Will there be more countries joining us in our growing circle of peace? We certainly hope so. So from us here at the Israel Brief and Lay of the Land, I just want to remind you that if you're looking for something to do this weekend, if you're not out celebrating, check out our website at www.layoftheland.online. Visit our Facebook page at Lotl site. Like us, follow us, share our content. Hey, it's free to do so. It also helps us get past those dodgy Facebook censors. If you are on YouTube, we are at the Israel Brief. Click on that red subscribe button. Let's get our community growing. And don't forget to follow us on Twitter at Lay of the Land with the digit 5. So from all of us to all of you, here's wishing us all a peaceful, a safe, a healthy, a prosperous and a happy new year. Happy 2022, everybody. I'm Rolene Marks. This is the Israel Brief, and I will catch you with those top stories in the new year.